so thrilled to be presenting in having Suleika Jaouad here, here in the virtual sense, in conversation with Cheryl Strayed, our friend from many books and many years, on the occasion of the publication of Suleika's extraordinary memoir, which has just come out in the last few weeks, Between Two Kingdoms, a book that in this time where you try and get a first book out, and or any book out, has been a challenge, or would seem a challenge, because so many of the ways that things happen haven't been happening, and yet the strongly beating heart that is at the heart of this book has really kind of grabbed readers and everyone, and in Suleika telling the story of her um, surviving cancer and this extraordinary journey. It's a book of journeys. It's actually, you open the book and there's a map of the United States, and it is the latter part of the book is a journey around the United States. But before that, it's a journey through illness and through living with that and surviving it, and in which is written of with great power and vividness and beauty in terms of what her writing. If this book wasn't so well written, then we might be having other conversations or other responses. But this book is going to be one of those enduring books because of the beauty of its writing, and again the indomitable spirit that she brings to this in this book. Many of you know the story, and actually I'm not going to say much about it because that's what the purpose of tonight is. You'll get to hear the story from Suleika and also in Cheryl in conversation. I will say a little bit about this book, which has come out and has drawn this response. Many of you first knew of Suleika's work through her New York Times column, Life Interrupted, that was a form of chronicling what she was going through and how that came about, and how that writing was done, often with great difficulty, is written of in this book. And she has also gone on, in terms of not only writing this book, but been active in other vital ways. She, or not this last president, but the president before, President Obama, she served on a cancer panel of his, and she today is also, if you go on to her website, I think you'll find out more about this work she's doing, an online project called Isolation Journal. So she's doing many things with not only this book, but with her journey through life. And tonight you'll get to hear from a bit of reading, and then the conversation with Cheryl. Cheryl, we first knew with her novel, Torch, and then of course her extraordinary memoir, Wild. And then since then, two books, one of which has its roots in her great podcasts, the Dear Sugar podcast, the book Tiny Beautiful Things, and then that wonderful book of these sayings and kind of spirit bolstering, a book that's been really good in these days called Brave Enough. Cheryl also is just one of those generous, gracious souls that a book like this and a chance to do something like this, she said, I'm on. And this evening, so it got worked out between their schedules. So they have not met in real life, and I think this is where we were talking beforehand if this constitutes meeting, but it is a form of meeting. And not only they in the conversation they'll have, but in your presence here as well. We would ask, so they're going to do a conversation, and then there is a time and place for you to put questions. We'd ask that on the bottom, at least at the laptop, you go to the Q&A place on your computer and put in questions, which the plan would be that Cheryl will read those later in the program. We know some of you have read this book, so you can bring that to it, or you've read the columns in responding besides what you'll hear tonight. Comments in the chat are great too. That's where applause is. That's where affirming comments are. That's where people there's all sorts of people that have known or met Suleika on her travels, or even Cheryl too, no doubt, in here with us tonight. So that's a good place for that. But the questions, please try and put those in the Q&A. I'm going to be scarce now and disappear, and I'll come back at the very end. My colleague Karen, who's also been making this really happen, is the one running the chat, and she'll be listing Suleika's book, but also Cheryl's as well, because those are books that continue to be read, and as well they should. So thank you all again, all over the world. You're here, and thank you all for joining us. And now, please give your good attention and your good energy and the kind of applause you do through the online world to Suleika Jaouad and Cheryl Strayed. Thank you both.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Rick. Hello, Suleika.
Hello, Cheryl.
I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited and so honored. And I know I've said it 1,000 times, but thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you. And what you and I have been in touch for, gosh, maybe 5 or 6 years, way back when you were writing the column for the New York Times, and we had a Skype interview one time. I think you interviewed me after Tiny Beautiful Things came out or something, but it's really lovely to kind of meet you here in this way, and really in particular to meet you through your beautiful book, which I was cheering for you before I opened it up. It was one of those things because I'm just so hard. I've always been rooting for you. I wanted to love it, but what happened is I didn't have to want to love it, because then I just loved it. I think it is so powerfully written, as people are saying in the chat, and as Rick said, it's so powerfully written. Such an incredible story of your life. And so I wanted to just start with the big question. Tell us about your book. Why, what do you say to people when they ask you, what's your book about? Tell us what your book's about and how it came to be.
Well, so I'll answer that by just mentioning briefly that when I interviewed you, I think it was about 5 years ago, I was 27. I just finished treatment, and I was in probably the most lost place I've ever been in. And that lasted for about a year. And towards the end of the interview, I remember mentioning to you that I knew I wanted to write a book, but I didn't want to write about illness. In fact, I was desperate to write about anything else. And you gave me some really good advice, which was essentially that you'll tell the story you need to tell, and you have no business trying to avoid it. And so this book for me is really about that journey through the kingdom of the sick, and not just about the experience, the physical experience of being ill, but the imprints that it leaves on your body, on your mind, on your family, on your relationships, on an entire community. And it's also the story of its aftermath, and the 15,000-mile road trip that I took when I was recovering from that experience. I briefly toyed with the idea of going on a hike, and very quickly realized that I barely had the physical stamina to sit behind the wheel of a car. So hiking was not in the realm of possibility. But that's what the book ended up being. And of course, it is about illness, and the question of how we move forward when our life is upended, because at the time that I was talking to you, that was very much the question that I was wrestling with, and trying to understand.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting to me. You told me that story before, and I remember that, and it's advice I've given to other people, and it's a struggle I've had myself, where you have that story that is the story you have to tell, and yet there's this resistance to it. And I'm curious, why is it that you didn't want to write about illness and cancer, even though it was like this story that was just, that had to be told, that you had to tell? Why do you think that you didn't want to write about it?
I think, at that point, I had this notion that my job, once I was done with treatment, was to move on from that experience. And what that meant was, kind of neatly putting that part of my life behind me, and that to write about it would be to remain in that experience. But the truth is that I've come to believe that moving on is a myth. We don't get to move on from the painful parts of our past. We have to learn to move forward with them, to integrate them into our present, and to learn to coexist with our heartbreaks and our sorrows. Um, so I was still in this place, of almost aspirationally wanting to believe, that I could either return to the person I'd been pre-diagnosis, or that somehow needed, to get to a place where I didn't talk about it, I didn't write about it, and it was firmly behind me.
Yeah, I want to get into so much of what you just said about that expectation that, once we're cured of something, like suddenly it's just like the journey's over, when really it's only just begun. You write some very interesting things about that in your book. But first, I want to back up just for those of the many people out there probably who haven't yet read the book, who are just tuning in. Maybe could we back up and could you just summarize briefly, what happened, when you were 22 and you got that diagnosis, that was not just leukemia, but also really for the first time in your life, I'm going to guess the first time in your life you contemplated mortality in any kind of
Mhm.
significant way, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, I was 22. I just graduated from college. I had gotten a job as a paralegal at a law firm in Paris. And being a paralegal wasn't necessarily my dream job, but I was really grateful to have it. It was paying my bills, and it also allowed me to live abroad. Um, but at the same time, I'd been plagued by this mysterious itch. And during those months in Paris, I was constantly coming down with some new cold or bout of bronchitis. Um, and on the one hand, I had this sense that something was wrong. And on the other, I think, like a lot of 22-year-olds, I felt immortal. Illness wasn't really something that was in my vocabulary. And so my fear began to take the form of a different kind of doubt, that I somehow couldn't cut it in the adult world. I remember sneaking off to the utility closet at my law firm to take naps in the middle of the day. And I took that as evidence, not that I was falling ill, but that I somehow wasn't succeeding at being an adult. So about, less than a year after I graduated from college, I found myself on a plane home. And shortly after I returned home, I was given this diagnosis of leukemia. And it was one of those moments where I felt a kind of cleaving. There was this clear sense of my life before, and everything that came after. And I knew, even if I didn't fully understand what was ahead, that I would be forever changed by this experience. Um,
Yeah. And then it was almost was it almost 4 years? Am I correct? Of essentially, uh, as you say, the title of your book, Between Two Kingdoms, is really about the kingdoms of the well and the kingdoms of the sick. So it was about 4 years that you were in the kingdom of the sick.
it was 4 years, and when I first got sick, I was so determined to remain the person I'd been.
Mhm.
I didn't want to call myself a cancer patient. I didn't want to go to support groups. I didn't want to read, you know, illness narratives or cancer memoirs. I was determined to, yeah, to stay the same person. Um, but of course, that didn't happen very quickly. I remember the first day that I was admitted to the hospital. I was given, a patient ID number. I had to cut my hair. And by the end of that summer, I looked like a completely different person. And cancer seemed to speak for me before I could, speak for myself. But I think, the amazing thing about the human species is that we're incredibly adaptive. And that kingdom of the sick uh, became normal to me.
Mhm.
I made friends with fellow cancer patients. I learned to speak fluent medicalese. I got used to living within those limitations, and it was actually the world outside my window that began to feel scary and overwhelming and foreign to me.
Mhm. Mhm. And in particular, you became dear friends with a woman named Melissa. Would you tell us about Melissa?
I would love to tell you about Melissa. I have two of her paintings behind me.
Mm.
One right over my head that it's actually a portrait that she painted of me, and one right over here that was one of the last paintings she made before she died. Um, so I think, being in a hospital is a lot like being in a big city. Like there's a way in which, especially when you're surrounded by a lot of people, you can feel profoundly lonely. And that was how I felt for so much of my treatment. I knew how lucky I was to have family, to have friends who came to see me. And yet I still felt so alone within that experience. And Melissa was one of the people who'd read the column I went on to write in the New York Times called Life Interrupted. And the second I got her message, I remember looking at her picture, seeing some of her art and thinking, oh, this is going to be my friend. I've never made a friend with someone my own age who's been sick. And I sent her a message and she replied and said she was getting chemo a couple flights up and that I should come visit her. And I went on to form a whole kind of cast of friends. We called ourselves the Cancer Crew. There was a poet, Max Ritvo, who was still at the time an undergraduate student at Yale. We had my friend Kristen, who'd been diagnosed with lymphoma, Erica with breast cancer, and we formed this kind of buddy system. We would accompany each other to chemo. We would, go thrifting together because our weight was constantly changing because of treatment. And Melissa and I actually got matching black leather jackets. And I remember we went out to dinner and it was a group of 4 girls and we all had about a 1/4 inch of hair. And a man at the table next to us turned to us and asked if we were a biker gang, which seemed actually kind of on point. But having these friendships, these people who had lived through what I'd lived through, who, I could speak to without any need for self-censorship, who understood the ways in which illness can, heighten the good and the bad. And it can really, at times bring you down to your most, primal, savage self was such a tremendous gift to to be able to meet those friends.
Yeah, and I think about too that they're in so many ways, like you said, they're like the only people. You're surrounded by all these people who love you, who've known you all of your life, who will continue to love you, but none of them are living the life you're living. And there are those people. A lot of them died, Melissa included.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can. We want to hear some beautiful words from you. And so I'm wondering if you can read a passage in the book, the piece about Melissa and what happened, what you did after she died. Could you do that?
I would love to. So on the 1-year anniversary of Melissa's death and the end of my treatment, I traveled to India, which was a place she had visited toward the end of her life that she loved. And I brought with me a vial of her ashes that her parents had given to me and asked me to scatter. Okay. Taking Melissa's ashes to the place she loved most doesn't lessen the pain of losing her, but it has shown me a way that I might begin to engage with my grief. It has introduced me to the role of ritual and mourning, the ceremonies that allow us to shoulder complicated feelings and confront loss, that make room for the seemingly paradoxical act of acknowledging the past as a path toward the future. It gets me thinking about the other ways we mark the crossing of thresholds: birthdays and weddings and baby showers, baptisms and bar mitzvahs and quinceañeras. These rites of passage allow us to migrate from one phase of our lives to another. They keep us from getting lost in transit. They show us a way to honor the space between no longer and not yet. But I have no predetermined rituals. They are mine to create. From a distance of several continents, I am able to see my life with clearer eyes. For too long, I've been like a bee trapped inside a window, smashing my forehead against the glass with mounting desperation in a futile attempt to get out. These last 2 weeks have provided a temporary respite, but I worry that once I'm back home in New York, I'll return to that sad, stuck state. I feel I have to do something drastic to ensure I won't. On the long flight home, I daydream about embarking on a solo pilgrimage, though what form it might take, I don't know. I want to be in motion, to figure out a way to unmoor myself, to thrust myself into the greater expanses of the world, not because I have a particular hankering to explore, but precisely because I've grown afraid of the world and my ability to navigate it alone. I want to expect nothing, to ask for nothing, to depend on no one, to find out what lies on the other side of the in-between place, to start living again.
Beautiful. Gosh, it's gorgeous to hear it in your voice. You know, I read the book and I also listened to it. I mean, I went back and forth between reading it and then I would listen to, and I loved your voice in the audiobook too. So that was the spark of this idea. So you travel, because I just want to be clear, Melissa died just shortly before you got a clean bill of health. Is that right?
Yeah.
You were
Yeah.
considered cured of cancer right as she died of it.
Yes. Yep. You know, I think for pretty much the entirety of those 4 years, I was focused on one goal, which was to survive this experience. And I hadn't really given much thought as to what would happen if and when I emerged from it. Um, and by the time I was declared cancer free and I was done with treatment, I had lost so many of my close friends, and including Melissa. I'd gone through a breakup with my longtime partner and caregiver. Um, and I felt so sort of physically wrecked by that experience, that once I was finally done, I didn't feel done. I felt like the hard work of recovery and healing had only begun. And that came as a great surprise to me. In part also because often, when we read about illness, the final act is being cured. And everyone around me was congratulating me and, saying how excited they were for me and how excited I must be. But I didn't feel excited. And I felt a deep shame about that. I felt like I should somehow be resuming my life, but I didn't know what my life was going to look like or really who I was.
Yeah, and I really identified with that part of your book, and I was thinking about it. It applies to so many kinds of trauma. When your mission has to be survival, when that's the thing you have to occupy yourself with, you really, obviously, and then you come out the other end of it and you have survived. That I think we really conceive of that as the end. And it's like, oh no, it's actually the beginning. It's the end of their survival mode, but it's the beginning of the healing journey. In some ways, all those 4 years, obviously what you're trying to do is heal. But it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that that healing journey didn't begin until that trip that you took to India, as you started to confront your grief about Melissa, and also your grief about everything you had been through in
Yeah.
your own cancer, as a cancer patient.
And I think part of it is also related to agency. Like when you get sick or someone you love gets sick, there's only so much that you can do. In fact, you kind of have to cede so much control. And I spent, yeah, those 4 years not being able to think ahead. The future became a very scary place. I could only think as far as my next, blood test or my next biopsy. And I learned to be hyper present. I learned to surrender, to the changing treatment protocols, to the decisions that were being made. But when you're on the other side of that experience, suddenly you have choice again. You
Mhm.
have options, which is obviously a good thing, but it can feel like an overwhelming thing when you've just been focused on surviving day in and day out.
Mhm.
And that difference between surviving and living wasn't one that I'd really considered before. And so the survival skills that I'd honed when I was sick and that had served me well were no longer appropriate in the context of the world of the living.
Yeah. I mean, and then another layer of this is, of course, your age. You were in those years that there was so much. I mean, we are becoming really very much in our early 20s, right? And all of that time that you were becoming, you had to ask that question that most people don't have to ask, which is, will I become, will I survive this? So I'm curious about what happened when you got back to the US. You have this idea that you want to go on a pilgrimage. You have this idea that a journey, an actual physical journey, is going to be healing to you. I don't know if you even did you think of it in those terms, that it's going to be healing, or was it that just that how do I find out who I am now, after this experience? But how did you come to take the road trip you did, and tell us about that a bit?
Yeah. So, I felt completely consumed by fear. I felt paralyzed by that fear.
What
And
were
like
you afraid of?
everything, I had gotten used to having a caregiver. And so the experience of not having caregivers, of being alone, felt scary. I felt unsafe in my own body. There was a sense of, constant hypervigilance. Every time I had a cough, every time I found a bruise on my leg, I would kind of spiral into a panic and think to myself, okay, my leukemia is back, or it's returned in some other form. Um, I was afraid of so many sort of unanswered questions. I wondered how I could possibly hold down a job when I was still, going to the emergency room for complications, when I still needed to spend so much of the day in bed. I wondered how to even begin to date
Mhm.
and to talk about what I'd been through, if at all, or if anyone would want to date someone who was very much in that liminal space where on paper I was better, but off paper I was very far from being a healthy, happy,
Mhm.
quote unquote normal 27-year-old. I wondered about having children or even, long-term commitments like marriage, given my high likelihood of relapse. And so I think I had this sense that, I had gotten used to living within these small spaces, within um, within what felt safe, which, by the end of that experience was my bedroom. And I knew at that point that if I didn't do something drastic, there was a way in which I would become encased by that fear, and that I'd stay in that stuck place. And so the decision was really born from a sense of urgency and also desperation, and this feeling that there was a better, more beautiful, kind of truer version of a life that I could be living. And I had no idea what that was, but I knew that I needed to leave the familiar, and that I needed to learn to be alone, and to feel comfortable being alone and confident, and that I needed, the space to reflect on what had happened, and where and who it was I wanted to become going next.
Yeah, and that's such a classic. You took such a classic journey, right? I mean, so many of us have, when we've been lost, said, I'm going to go out, I'm going to travel, I'm going to move to find it. But you had also a particular mission that was connected to the connections you made during your illness. You mentioned earlier this column you'd written for the New York Times about your experience as a cancer patient. And so many people, really around the world, but around the nation, is this right, wrote to you.
Mm.
And those were the people you visited on your road trip. Can you tell us about, like, your idea for that, and how did you decide, who did you decide to visit, and why? And tell us about that particular aspect of your trip.
Yeah, so, when I was sick, I was so isolated. But these letters that I started receiving really felt like kind of conduits to the outside world. And people interpreted the title of the column "Life Interrupted" in all kinds of ways. So I heard from people who were sick, but who were also dealing with different kinds of interruptions. And I had this old, wooden box from an antique store, and I got into the habit of putting the letters that really resonated with me most into that box, or printing out the emails that I knew I wanted to return to. Um, and during that last year after treatment, I found myself returning to those letters. I was in this space of trying, to, like I said, move on, looking around me at, my friends, and thinking to myself, like, what does a 27-year-old girl do? And almost like I felt like an anthropologist in a way.
Mhm.
Um, and it was this very inorganic kind of process of trying to fit myself back into the world. But these letters that I'd received were from people who had survived, things that were thought to be unsurvivable, who were, in the trenches of their own aftermath experiences, or a little further ahead. And so, I made a list of about 22 people, and I wrote to them before I left, and all of them responded, and many of them invited me to come and stay in their guest rooms or on their pull-out couches. And that really became my itinerary, which sounded wonderful until I actually got on the road and then realized, shit, I'm about to meet, a lot of these people are complete strangers.
Right.
No idea what's going to happen. And it was a little
Or
nerve.
how their couches will be.
Exactly. Um, and so, I visited a teenage girl named Unique in Florida, who was also recovering from cancer and preparing to rejoin the greater gathering. I visited my dear friend Catherine, who's here with us tonight, um, who lives in California, and had lost her son. I visited a man by the name of Little GQ in Texas, who was on death row, who'd written to me about our kind of unexpected parallels, and his experience in solitary confinement, and mine in isolation in a hospital room. Um, And, I call those people my road guardians, because really, initially I'd gone to visit them in part to say thank you, but those conversations that we had, um, their stories really were the sort of breadcrumb trail that I followed and that allowed me to begin to figure out my way forward.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm going to ask you, I didn't ask you I didn't warn you about this, but I wondered now that we're talking about some of those people you met on the road.
Yeah.
I think it's on page 234. It is. It's on page 234 of your book. Um, you are, where are you? The recovery, talk about forsaking the old self,
Mm,
the recovery. It's not I'm sorry, it's not actually when you're on the road. It's it's at the bottom of 234. You talk about recovery isn't a gentle self-care spree that restores you to a pre-illness state.
mm,
Just what you said reminded me of the ways that talking with other people who sometimes say something they're not even necessarily trying to bestow wisdom, right? But they say something and that it rings a bell inside of you and it becomes something that changes your life.
yeah.
That, this person who's saying, recovery isn't about going back to the former self, but learning how to accept the new self in this new life.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about, if this trip, if this trip was really all about that, like, who am I going to be? As you said, who am I going to be after this experience? I can't go back and be the person I was. Did it feel like it was working? Like, as you were on the trip, when did you start to feel that kind of change coming about? When did you start to feel the sort of healing that you ultimately wrote about in this book?
Yeah. So, I would never have admitted this to anyone or to myself before I left, but I did have this kind of hope that somehow I would go on this road trip and that by the end of it, I would feel like I'd found my way back to the kingdom of the well. And pretty immediately it became clear to me that that wasn't going to happen. Um, or at least not in the sense that I'd imagined. And that passage that you just referred to was actually my first stop on the road.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, okay. It was on.
and
Okay.
yeah, to see a teacher named Ned, who's teaching at an all-girls boarding school in Connecticut. And he was someone who'd written me a letter about the difficulties of what he called returning to normalcy
Mhm.
after a traumatic experience like cancer. And I'd gotten that letter several years earlier, and it had enraged me, because I remember thinking, I just learned, had a bone marrow transplant, just learned that I was going to have to restart chemo. And I remember thinking, what could possibly be so hard about returning to normalcy? And all I want, all I want is that. And of course, I came to understand his letter differently when I found myself struggling with the same challenges he'd written to me about. But because it had been several years, I think when I went to see him, I hoped that he would be kind of speaking to me from the kingdom of the well, and that he'd be able to offer guidance.
Mhm.
Um, and I can read this, just these couple of sentences.
Yeah.
But he was very much still living with the imprints of that experience, and said to me, I'm not sure it's ever possible to climb over that barbed wire to fully return to the kingdom of the well. I think for a lot of us, we live somewhere between the two. And I'll just read this. Um, there is no restitution for people like us, no return to days when our bodies were unscathed, our innocence intact. Recovery isn't a gentle self-care spree that restores you to a pre-illness state. Though the word may suggest otherwise, recovery is not about salvaging the old at all. It's about accepting that you must forsake a familiar self forever in favor of one that is being newly born. It is an act of brute, terrifying discovery.
Mm.
And, so there was this way in which, at least physically, because of my compromised immune system, I was constantly, coming down with colds, and that and my fatigue chased me across state lines. But also there were ways in which I could actually feel myself getting stronger. When I first left for the road, I would drive about an hour and a half, and then I'd have to find, a McDonald's parking lot where I could park and take a nap because I was so physically exhausted. I had never thought of driving as a physically strenuous sport, but it definitely felt that way. But by the time I got to Texas, I was driving, 8-hour, 10-hour days. And it was so thrilling and exciting to me because I could feel my, my strength and my endurance coming back to me, even if it wasn't, what it had been before diagnosis. So it was both experiences. It was understanding and accepting that I wasn't ever fully going to return to the person I'd been, but also seeing ways in which, in part because of these imprints of illness, I was getting to experience the world in a way I never would have otherwise. I was getting to meet these incredible people. I was getting to discover new places because of my parking lot pit stop naps. And there was something kind of beautiful about that.
Right. So you could feel that shifting as you went. But I think that, for myself in my own journeys, I think, and I've talked to so many people who've journeyed, we very often go out there saying like, I'm going to arrive at this place. And when I'm done with it, I'm going to feel this this glorious, exultant feeling. And in fact, it's usually a smaller thing. It's more humble than that. And yet what happens is when you remember that experience, I think is a lot of times when the deepest healing takes place because you have some perspective on all the things you learned. And in so many ways, I think that writing a book does that, right? When you wrote this book, you got to not just relive all of the difficult stuff with your cancer, but the beautiful stuff on your journey. And could you tell us a bit about that process? What did you learn as you wrote this book? A lot of times people think, oh, it's a memoir. So Suleika sat down and she knew exactly what was going to come out. But what I know is that's not the case. Like we know the plot of our lives, but we don't know what's going to happen when we actually start to write about them. So I'd love for you to tell us a bit about the experience of writing the book and what cracked your heart open. What was hard for you? What was scary for you? What was surprising to you?
So, I think strangely, the part of the book that maybe others might assume was hard for me to write, which was the part of the book where I'm very sick, was such a joy to write. I had distance on that experience enough that I felt a kind of intuitive pull towards certain memories. But more than that, I got to live in the world of my book with friends like Melissa, who were no longer in my life. And it was actually really hard for me to move on from part one of the book because I loved getting to sit in my office and to be with those friends in a way that now I don't get to spend many hours a day writing about those memories. So that I think surprised me. The sort of joy, not obviously of reliving, the the trauma of it, but the joy of those moments when like grief even just briefly shifts from like this gutting kind of ache to the joy of remembering something or recalling a conversation. And that was such a surprising kind of delight. Writing the second part of the book, the aftermath of that experience was so incredibly difficult. I was almost 2 years late in turning in my manuscript, and I just couldn't figure out how to write about that experience. And I kept trying to write about it in the past tense, and it felt forced, and it didn't feel like it was coming from the most authentic place that I could write it from. And it was only until I realized that I was allowed to shift tenses in the middle of the book and that I could write that second part in the present tense that it kind of broke that experience open for me. Because the truth was and is that, I was still living that recovery.
Mhm.
I wasn't on the other side of it. I'm still living it now. And so writing it in the present tense allowed me to write into that uncertainty, and to not have to sound, transformed or like I had, the distance of many, many years to reflect on what that recovery, and that process of moving forward was like.
I love that, the writer in me is just like cracking up because, like I know you probably, like you probably spent a whole year like agonizing over the tense, and I didn't even notice. I didn't even notice. It's like, oh, I look at the book. Oh, you're right. Okay, part one, past tense. Part two, present tense. But here's the thing. The only rule is that, like, yeah, you can't like switch in the middle of a sentence or a paragraph. But I think it works just fine. I mean, like, I think the whole point of decisions like that is you want it to be seamless, and it was. But you were stuck on that. That's fascinating. What
I was,
about
yeah.
what about what's one of the challenges with writing about real life is there's so much of real life. I mean, a lot of decision making when it comes to writing memoir is about, what to include and what to exclude. What's not in the book?
So much is not in the book. In part two of the book, I wrote a 60-page chapter that I was very worried about, because I was worried that it would hurt someone close to me. And I remember, at the time I was sending, I had a system with my friend, and the incredible author, Melissa Febos, who actually has an essay collection coming out soon called Girlhood. So please pre-order it.
I love Melissa. She's amazing.
She's amazing. So because I was struggling so much with part two of the book, she came up with a system where she would send me Google Calendar invites where I would have to send her a chapter by a certain time and date. And she wasn't necessarily reading them immediately, but it was just an accountability thing. And if I didn't send her my chapter, she would send me a text and say, what's going on? So I sent her the 60-page chapter.
I'm going to call Melissa after this and make her do this with me.
It's a really useful thing. I highly recommend it to anyone who's trying to write a book. So I sent her the 60-page chapter and I said, I'm really worried about, how this person will feel about it. And she said, well, keep writing, but you have to have a conversation with them before, you send it out or publish it. And I kept writing and I got to the end of the book and Melissa called me and she said, did you have that hard conversation? And I said, I didn't, and I don't think that I can. And she was like, great, cut the 60 pages. And I cut the 60 pages and I sent the manuscript to my agent and to my editor, and nobody ever noticed. And it was so, it was such an important lesson for me, that like sometimes you have to write through something in order to kind of continue beyond it. And I don't think I could have written the book if I hadn't, spent those 2 months or whatever it was working on those 60 pages. Yeah.
And you
but I
also
think,
write through it to see what's necessary, and you can't necessarily tell beforehand, right? So like you thought, okay, this person, this story about this person is really important to me, and so it might be really important to the book, and I can't tell until I write it. and then you can see like, oh, actually, even though it is important in my life, the book doesn't require this. And I think that's a really, we always get the question, and I know we're going to turn to audience questions in a moment, but that often comes up with Memoir, that question about the problem, like I always say, the most unfortunate thing about writing Memoir is that other people exist,
Right.
and that you have to write about them. You have to write about the people in your life. And it's tricky because, literature requires a kind of truth telling that life sometimes finds uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I hear this so much. I think it's the biggest reason why people don't write memoirs, because they're afraid of how others might react. But
Yeah.
this idea that there's, the book you write for yourself, and then there's the book that you share with others. And the gap between those two can be quite big. And so once I understood that I could write and that I would, be able to later go back and make certain decisions, I felt freed. I even had a dear friend of mine from college do a read of my manuscript for pettiness. I wanted, to be fair and honest, and I didn't want to write from a place of anger or pettiness. So she found, I think, one place that she pointed out to me. But yeah, it was a big preoccupation for me, and something that really kind of kept me up at night.
Yeah, I relate. Okay, so we've now entered the time where we're going to get some audience questions. Right now there are 45, but I can already see like the second question is kind of the most important one that we could ask, and I'm sort of appalled that I haven't already asked this. Is Oscar there? Sam wants to know, where the hell is Oscar? And
It's a really
explain
good question.
to people who Oscar is.
Okay, so Oscar is my scruffy terrier mutt who I adopted shortly after my bone marrow transplant. Oscar is not here because when I say he's badly behaved, I'm not joking. He's actually so badly behaved that I did 2 book events, one with Liz Gilbert and one with Tara Westover, and each of them individually recounted being bit by Oscar. And he, they're not, deadly bites. They're little 15-pound dog love bites. But the next day on Twitter, I saw someone give him the title, The Writer Biter, which I love. So all this to say, Oscar is not fit for Zoom calls because he will make them all about him and try to steal the show with his barking.
He can't even do we can't even do virtual Oscar. Yeah.
Can't take him anywhere.
So this question, and I know a lot of people have it. It comes up a lot. It's sort of on the subject of writing about other people. And it is, have you and Will kept in touch, or what was it like writing about, with such really beauty and intensity and truth? I thought, there's all this hard stuff about cancer, but I also thought just what a beautiful job you did in writing a love story. And with just all, you just went all the way there. And I just was like, you captured so well what it feels like to fall in love at that age and to be in Paris and fall in love. Like, not that I ever got to fall in love in Paris, but it seems really fun, So what about Will?
Yeah, so I think about him all the time because I'm now, around the age that he was when he broke up, and I've asked myself the question of like, what would it be like at this point in my life, to put aside my career, to move into a significant other's parents' home to care for someone the way he did for me. And, it's really the moment I think of accountability that all relationships seem to arc toward, how we show up for each other in those most difficult moments. And he showed up for me and then some. He was so extraordinary. And I'm, forever grateful to him for that. Because he really sort of ushered me through the hardest passage. In terms of the book, it was really important to me that everyone who was in it be given the chance to read the manuscript
Mhm.
before anyone else had. I know a lot of memoirists have different feelings about how
Right.
to handle this, but it's such a personal story. I wanted it to feel accurate and honest. I also worked with an incredible fact checker, Ben Phelan, because I come from a journalism background. And because there are so many stories that go beyond my own, from the stories of the people I meet on the road to friends of mine, and that process was really interesting. I learned so much, and I think it made the book infinitely better because of it. There were so many details and like snippets of dialogue that I wouldn't have remembered,
Mhm.
and so that was a really interesting experience.
Yeah.
What about you? How do you handle
Oh,
writing?
no, I think it's such a complicated answer. And, to write, like I said, to write about real people, sometimes you can say to the person, do you want to read what I've written? Or I want to talk to you about it. Other times you just have to make the decision to protect their identity by giving them a different name, but still telling the truth about who they were or what your relationship was. It's a really, and I care a lot about, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and I don't want to invade their privacy.
Yeah.
And I have to think very deeply if I'm going to do either of those things without their permission. It's
Yeah.
complicated.
Yeah.
So Rhoda asks me, or asks me to ask you, dear Suleika, she said she loved your book. And by the way, Rhoda is my dear friend, Rhoda
Oh,
Ahmed. She's also an author. And we love her. I love her. Suleika doesn't love her, but she will someday.
I love her already.
What, what advice would you give your teenage self?
Oh, that's an excellent question.
And while you're thinking about it, I'll say Rhoda wrote a beautiful children's book called May Among the Stars about Mae Jemison, the first Black woman in space. So yeah, get to check it out. So she's saying to you, what advice would you give your younger self?
Okay, spend less time thinking about boys. I yeah, if I could like take all the hours I lost as a teenager thinking about boys and channeled it into some other hobby, I would be fluent in like 30 languages by now. I would say that. And also, I was one of those teenage girls who like wanted to be a grown-up. I was always lying about my age. I was always trying to act older than I was. I was always trying, to kind of skip ahead of my adolescence. And I think back on that time, and it's one of the rare times, I think, in a life where you don't have to know who you are. You don't have to know your major or what you're going to do or what career or many careers you're going to lead, um, and to revel in that not knowing, to experiment and try different things and follow your curiosities, and not feel like you have to set yourself on a path and know what you're going to do.
Good advice. Okay, there's so many questions. It's just like I'm kind of like my mind is spinning. It's hard to be. It's like a terrible thing to be the one picking. It's like, okay, here we go. Here's a question. Amal asks, as a fellow leukemia survivor and world traveler, do you have any advice on how to approach transitioning to survivorship during COVID when travel is so uncertain? Any advice for an aspiring writer with no experience? I'm an epidemiologist. I similarly said my cancer would not become my life, but I want to use my experience to raise awareness and share my story.
Mm.
So it's a couple questions. That's like take a week to answer it. But during, you talked about travel as this part of your healing. How do we do that? How do people who are faced with this do that during these times?
Mm.
And how to step into that world of becoming an advocate
Yeah,
beyond the self. Yeah.
I will say my friend Carmen, who I have the joy of working with, drove here from Texas during COVID, and she did it safely. And the way she did it was by borrowing her niece's porta potty, which she kept in the back seat of her car so that she wouldn't have to use rest stops. So I have heard of people, finding sort of creative workarounds. But for most of us, me included, and in part because of my immune system, traveling isn't possible. I've had to be extra careful. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but in the book, I write about the 100-day project that my friends and family did when I was very sick and very much stuck in place. And the concept of it was really simple, that we were each going to do one creative act every day for 100 days. And my dad's was to write 100 childhood memories about growing up in Tunisia, which he compiled into a little booklet and gave to me at the end. My mom painted a ceramic tile every day that she assembled into a kind of shield and hung above my bed. She called it Suleika Shield, and she told me it had protective powers. And my 100-day project was to journal. And at that point, I was not feeling inspired or writerly. On a lot of days, my journal entries were like one sentence, often just like one word, occasionally just the F word. But that sense of structure and kind of picking a project where the stakes felt low, in a liberating way, where I could just kind of explore and try something different and new, was its own kind of traveling. And that journal led me to all kinds of unexpected places. So yeah, 100-day journal. As for being an advocate, um, I think there are, so many different ways to be an advocate. But I'd also say that, like, when I finished treatment, I very much like felt a tremendous amount of pressure to make something of this experience, to turn it into something useful. Um, and I think that's a wonderful thing, but it can also feel like a lot of pressure when you're in the early stages of this kind of healing and recovery. And so I would say there's time uh, to figure out what that looks like. And the most important thing is to kind of be an advocate for yourself, as corny as that sounds. But I think it's crucial, especially when you're kind of newly emerging.
Okay, this question is from Allison. I have a friend, 32, who was recently in January diagnosed with AML. I came across your book and knew I had to read it. I loved it so very much. But my question for you is, when do you think an appropriate time would be to share this book with her? At what point do you think you would have been receptive to and appreciated a book like your own?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your friend, but I'm very glad she has a friend like you. The very fact that you're asking this question says so much. Books are such personal things, so it's hard for me to answer that. But I got all kinds of books, some of which I read. Actually, one of the first books I was gifted was Tiny Beautiful Things. And I was just thinking about this today, but I think in some ways, Cheryl, your relationship with your, readers or advice seekers planted a kind of seed for me, in terms of the letters and the correspondences I would later have. But I think you can give this book, you can give any book to your friend, and they will decide if and when they want to read it, and they'll know. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. A few people are asking, this one in particular is from Harper, but I see a few along these lines. What's your relationship with your identity as a sick person now that you're post-cancer? Other questions are essentially saying like, was it in some ways hard for you to let go of that identity as like a cancer patient, that identity that you resisted, but then you lived within that world? What's your relationship with that now?
Yeah, it was so hard for me, and it sounds, kind of weird to say, but in that first year, I almost missed being sick. I didn't, miss having cancer, but I missed the hospital ecosystem. I missed the nurses and doctors and the patients. Like that felt familiar to me. Um, and I'm now almost 6 years out of treatment. I don't miss the hospital. I do still love my nurses and doctors and friends, and I like getting to see them every couple of months. But I do feel a kind of welcome distance from that part of my life. But I also, depending on the day, don't feel fully well. I still, I have right next to me a little sort of lap desk that I use because I still spend a couple hours a day either working from bed or working from this reclining armchair, which has been my saving grace in the last year. And I've had to learn to, figure out how to exist within certain physical limitations that I still have. I still take medications every day. I still, go in for checkups every couple of months. But the kind of yeah, but so much of that has softened. It doesn't feel as present for me. I don't think about it necessarily every day. And so it's changed.
So we have to wrap up soon. We're sadly running out of time, but a couple of last questions about just maybe like you can answer these in like sort of in order. People are asking, how are your parents? How's your family? How did you step back into like kind of the dating, marriage, like all of that kind of stuff? And what's on the horizon for you? What's next for you as just a person and a writer?
Mhm.
What's going on next?
Well, my family's doing so well. They're here tonight. My brother too. Um, as for dating, a couple, not when I sort of emerged from that experience, I ended up dating someone who I'd first met at band camp when I was 13 years
I
old.
know, I love that. You meet your real love at band camp.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I think 13 is probably the most awkward age, and band camp is the most awkward place. Yeah. So there was a lot of awkwardness then, and certainly a lot of awkwardness as I tried to navigate, dating and this strange new body that I had, and was figuring out so much. And we're still together now. He's in the main house. He actually lent me his ring light, which you can't see, um, but has allowed this room to not look as dark as it typically does at this time of night. Um, and as for what's next, I think like a lot of people, we're in our own kind of process of reentry. Um, and figuring out what that means. This year has been so difficult, so unexpectedly good in certain ways. It's been nice to be at home, to kind of have a sort of respite from the culture of busyness. I don't miss cocktail parties. I don't miss, uh, going out for coffee and lunch. There's so many things I miss. I miss hugging people. I very much wish we were all in the same room together tonight. But I think, in a weird way, this isolation has felt familiar to me. It reminds me of some of the things I had to kind of learn to endure when I was sick. So I've taken this time to work on the isolation journals, which Rick mentioned, and I'm working on a book idea, which I won't talk about because I don't want to jinx it. But yeah, I think that's what's next for me. More books.
Awesome. We need more books from you, Suleika. What a really beautiful, inspiring conversation. Thank you for all of your wise words and for sharing your story with us tonight, and also in this gorgeous book that I love and treasure. Such a lovely time chatting with you. And thank you to all of you who have joined us.
Cheryl, thank you. You are extraordinary. And I'm very, very grateful. And this is
Thank you,
so
my
fun.
dear. Thank you, my dear.
And I will come in just to say thank you to everyone. And there's no words really adequate to say what could be said, but to thank you both, Suleika and Cheryl, for this. This has been extraordinary, beyond extraordinary. For all of you who've been writing in the chat along the way, that'll be collected, and so Suleika will have a chance to read your comments, because some of them, those have been quite moving and compelling stories. So she'll get a chance to see those. And I would agree with Suleika, what she just said about wishing we were all in the same place. But I also think there's been an intimacy, the way the two of you have done this tonight, and the way all of us have been able to listen to this and hear it and see it. That's also very special. And because I think this book, sometimes you get a book like, saying this kind of thing, and if you get too babbly with conversations, it comes and goes. And this way you get to really hold it in. And I'm going to go for a long walk after this for myself in the Seattle night, that kind of thing, as we are isolated in so many ways right now. But this book really speaks to that as well. So to everyone who's joined us from all over the world tonight, we thank you again, and do take up this book, those of you who haven't, but many of you have, and that's been gratifying to read those comments and that response. And to thank you both again so much. Cheryl, it's great to see you as always. And
Always,
Suleika,
thank you.
and Suleika, it does say this is your first book on the book itself, so that portends more. And so we're glad to hear you've got that in mind, and we look forward to whatever else you write, and for carrying on with what you're doing. We thank your colleague Lindsay for all her help with tonight, and everyone else, and my friends and colleagues at Elliott Bay Book Company as well. Good night, everybody, and thank you also for being up late, Suleika. It's on the night back where you are. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Be well, and thank you again for all of this. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.